After d4, d5, and bishop to g4, white is playing the Pseudo-Trompowsky. And now, as we know from some of the previous videos, we played c5. And in the previous videos, we went through c3, and we saw some lines with knight f3. In this video, we're going to go through e3 mostly. However, before we do that, let's quickly have a look at another idea. After knight f3, as mentioned in the previous videos, you take the pawn in d4, and now white will go on with knight d4. However, I did not mention queen takes in d4. Now, this is just bad, because you just carry on with development. Knight c6, and now the queen will have to move. So let's just explore how the ideas will be, how the game will go, more or less, so that we can move on to the main topic of the video. So if the queen goes to h4, for example, the theme to remember here is that both the diagonal attackers, meaning the bishop and the queen, of the dark squares are now on the king side. Therefore, we're going to play queen to b6. This is a very strong move because it's attacking the b2 pawn, and now it's basically forcing white to play a move like bishop to c1. But this is now just absolute rubbish by white because it's undeveloping the pieces. So let's not look at that, and let's look at b3. What if white wants to carry on like that? This is the only way, because what else is there to do? If knight to c3, you can just take the pawn in b2, and this is a fork. It's not like one of those positions where our opponent can find a way out to, I don't know, give up the pawn in b2 and then carry on with development. That's not a poison pawn. b3, okay, attack the bishop. The bishop will have to move. Let's look at two ideas just to quickly get out of this silly line, and then let's go to the main topic of the video. Bishop to e3 with an attack on the queen. Queen to c7. And now our opponent cannot develop the light square bishop, unless white will have to waste tempos again, and white will have to give up another move with the bishop, but then we can just carry on with development. Position is already evaluated -2 for a reason. It's like we're almost up a piece, even though we're not even up a pawn. Let's make an example. If white plays g3, for example, to develop from the fianchetto, this seems to be making sense, but now e5, taking the center, and bishop g2, the game is completely compromised already. Black plays e4, the knight will have to move. There's nowhere to go for the knight, unless, okay, well, there's d4 and g5. But knight g5, obviously you can't take the knight with the pawn, because then the queen's attacking the rook. But queen e5 is a fork, wins the piece basically, because you're also attacking the rook. Now you may say that actually white can play c3, and now you're not going to take this knight because the knight's protected by the bishop, and the queen is not even going to take the rook, obviously. But here you play bishop e7, and that's it. You're now exploiting the pin, and there's no coming back. There's no moves here. Maybe f4 you're thinking to protect that more, but obviously now here you can take en passant, and then the knight can take back. You might say if bishop takes queen, then knight can take this queen, and maybe white can try to, and maybe this will work, but this is simply wrong, because queen takes bishop, the attack on the queen remains. So let's move on. So back a couple of moves. After b3 we play h6, the bishop has to move, and we're looking at bishop e3, okay, queen c7. g3 to develop the bishop from the fianchetto, e5, bishop g2, e4. What if knight goes to d4? This seems to be making sense. g5 attacks the queen. And bear in mind that yes, the pawn in h6 is pinned, so bishop seems to be able to take the pawn for free, but then you lose the control of the knight. And the knight can't take the knight first because you're attacking the queen. So queen h5 now has to move from the attack of the pawn. Knight f6 traps the queen. So in this position, after h6, if white doesn't play bishop e3, but rather bishop to d2, so that the light square bishop can develop from this diagonal, seems to be potentially available later on. This is also rubbish. G5 comes now, and the queen will have to move again, besides we're developing the bishop in this perfect diagonal. This pawn cannot be taken. Knight to g5 seems possible, because you can't take back. When I play bishop g7, right, you're attacking the rook, and you're threatening to win the knight because the bishop is defending the rook. That's it. There's no coming back. And it's not like white can play, I don't know, a sacrifice, like knight takes f7 with an attack on the rook, and say, you take my rook, I take yours. No, you just take here. And there's nothing. Queen f4 check, knight f6 develop. That's it. So let's make a recap, and then we can finally change topic. Bishop g5, c5, knight f3 line. Okay, take the pawn. Queen takes. This variation, you attack the queen. What if the queen tries to go to this side, like queen a4? Okay, bishop to d7. This comes with development. e3, developing the light square bishop. Okay, f6, thematic move. We're attacking the bishop will have to move. And the good thing to remember about when you face the Trompowsky is that you can play this pawns like this. The F diagonal is not weak. It's usually something that you want to be careful to, but in this case you're perfectly safe. Now here, let's make an example. If white just develops the bishop like this, let's say bishop e2, right? Knight e4 traps the queen. You see how this bishop is attacking this diagonal, the bishop the other diagonal, the queen the other diagonal, the pawn's attacking this square, the knight's attacking this square, and that's it. There's nowhere to go for the queen. The only thing left to do at this point for the white queen is to take the knight, and in this case, well, obviously we will take the queen, and now white is winning because white has two knights and we only have one of them. No, I'm kidding. I'm gonna do my best in this game to try and swap those knights as soon as possible because I'm terrified of them. So back in this position after queen e4, we mentioned how bishop e2, you just trap the queen, just like that. So what if queen to b3, best move by white, putting pressure on b7. Okay, knight g2, e7, and we don't care, because we don't have to worry about b7. In fact, if queen goes to b7, rook b8 is the best move, queen goes to a6, only move, but now rook to b6, and the queen is forced to go to e2, because, well, d3 comes with a fork, and where else to go? I mean, all of these squares come with threats. You see, queen a3, you're going on the same diagonal as this bishop, and in that case you will play knight g6. You're completely winning right now. Comes with an attack on the bishop is defended, although we would love to take that bishop anyway, but comes with an attack on the queen. Queen d3 gets forked, queen to c3, you can play bishop b4, pins the queen to the king, queen b3. Obviously none of these squares is accessible. What about queen a4? Okay, well, knight to d4 once again. Now in this case you might argue that the only move possible for our opponent is to play, well, queen e5 or maybe queen takes pawn in e7. But queen a5 or e7, let's make an example. If queen a7 here, knight c2, you win the rook. And if instead queen a5, then obviously bishop b4 wins the queen, because this is it's a fork. The queen is forced to take, but the knight c2 wins the queen. So back in this position, white just played queen b3, best move, knight g2 e7, and we mentioned that queen takes b6, b7 is a poison pawn, because rook b8, queen a6, rook b6, queen e2 we didn't mention, but now the best move is rook b2. Position evaluated as if black was more than half a piece. White can't develop the light square bishop, and the development of black play is fluid. So in this position, once again, queen b3, queen cannot take b7. We just played knight g2 e7, white to move. What if white goes on with development? Bishop to e2. Knight to a5 attacks the queen. The queen will have to move, but where? Queen a3 runs pretty much in the same scenario we've seen. Queen to b4, pretty much same scenarios we've seen. The knight now is also protecting in b7. So if queen, let's say b4, here we have this tactic, e4 attacks the knight, we should be winning the knight. If the knight moves anywhere, you have this discover attack on the queen, so the knight will move with an attack on this bishop, let's say knight d4, right? Most accurate move is knight f5 now, comes with an attack on this bishop, whilst it also comes with an attack on this queen. So in this position, after knight a5, what if queen to c3? Okay, knight to g6, and after the bishop goes to g3, queen to b6. Now we're threatening bishop b4, winning the game because we're pitting the queen to the king. a3 must come to save that from happening. Rook a to c8. Do you see now the problem with this variation? The fact that we're so well developed. Queen to d3 is now forced. But now e4 is not even the best move. Queen to b2, and we win the rook. There's no coming back here. Queen c3, queen d4, none of these moves are possible. So after castling, let's see how to simplify the game. You take the rook. You're winning here. Knight b to d2 comes with an attack on the queen. Just play the queen back to c3 and look for swaps. After the swap, you're up a rook. It's game over. GG. Queen takes in d5 maybe, but now queen to c5. Impose a swap of queens. Queen to e4 maybe escaping the swap. Well, no. Queen to c2. There's no way around this. This leads us to the start now. And so after the bishop g5 second move, c5, e3. This is the move that we haven't seen at all. Okay, f6. The bishop will have to move. Knight to c6. And now two options. Well, actually 3 options. One of them has to be mentioned, d takes in c5. This is now potentially going to be a transposition into something we've already seen in one of the previous videos. Here, there is no way to do the actual blockade with b4 because the bishop, the dark square bishop, is on this side of the board. So you're going to play e5. And that's it. You're going to be recapturing this pawn right now. Next move, you're taking this pawn. b4 is not a thing because you can just take it. There's no compensation. No, it's not a gambit or anything. So in this position, let's now look at d takes. What about a move like, okay, bishop d3. Here, this is like a temporary, it looks like a free pawn, but and actually it is. So they've played this move against me sometimes, and I actually did not take the pawn because I couldn't be bothered figuring out what was going to happen next. Because here, take, knight takes, I thought simply bishop check, pawn take, queen can recapture the knight, and then I can't really capture the bishop in h4 because the queen will take back. So what is it that I didn't see? Okay, bishop g6 actually does come now. Check, pawn takes, queen recapture the knight. Did we lose the initiative? No, because e5, and now the queen will have to abandon the defense of that bishop. There's nowhere to go except queen a4, but now bishop d7. Where can a queen go to protect that bishop? Nowhere. That means the rook will be winning a piece here. So this takes us to the start, and now we're going to look at the last thing, which is bishop to g5. e3, f6, bishop h4, knight c6. What if white develops the bishop to b5? Okay, take the pawn in d4, and now what's our opponent going to do? Pawn takes back is met with h5. This stops our opponent from playing queen h5 check, and also allows us to play g5, winning the bishop, because the bishop will have to go back to the only square available, and then h4, and the bishop is trapped. So this is what we're planning to do. We just played h5, and we have an idea of playing g5, winning the game on the spot. So white will have to play h3. Black plays bishop f5. And now white will have to develop. So knight f3. And now e6. Castle. Looks like a normal game, but here we begin with a sequence of forced moves that will indicate how easy it is to defeat the Trompowsky. g5. Bishop's forced to g3. h4. Bishop's forced to h2. g4. Well, white is forced to take, because if he doesn't take, we got an attack on the knight if the knight moves, but then we can take this pawn and come on. Of course the pawn will take. Bishop takes. The knight is pinned. Knight to d2 to defend the knight and to develop the pieces, obviously. Either way, we're going to play this move, h3. If white plays any move, let's make an example, c4, right? Just to make an example, you take the pawn in g2 to open the file for the rook, and also there's an attack on this rook, so king takes, and now bishop h3 will win the exchange, so that's pointless. So at this point, our opponent will not take, and rather after taking the pawn in g2, that will be simply a free pawn. Let's say in this position, instead of king takes, which allows us bishop h3, what if rook to e1, moving that away? Bishop to d6 is the obvious move now. The knight is still pinned, and we're threatening to just take this bishop for free. So if the bishop takes us, that allows us to infiltrate our queen. And so let's say bishop takes, queen takes back, and now our queen is attacking h2, but there's a knight defending there. And the funny thing is that we've got an incredibly strong pawn, and we're completely winning. Now the thing is, we're also going to be castling alongside. Position evaluated like -4, I think. It's inevitable at this point. -5 at this point. If king takes, this is even worse, because bishop check, king goes back, long castle. These moves are going to happen no matter what. Our opponent can't really make a move that makes any sense. If pawn takes, with the idea of opening the file maybe for the queen and the rook, look how stunning the development of the black player is. Knight g2 e7, completely ignoring the pawn, not recapturing the pawn, and even allowing the pawn to take the knight in c6, because then rook d to g8 is a forced mate in 4. So that's how the development is. It's so smooth. Let's go back a few moves. Let's actually make a recap. So bishop g5, c5, e3, f6, the bishop goes back, knight c6, the bishop b5 variation. Okay, take the pawn, pawn takes back, h5, we're making a threat of g5, so h3 is forced. Bishop to f5. Knight f3, e6, development, normally. Castle. g5 attacks the bishop. Bishop has to move. h4, bishop has to move. g4, the pawn has to take back. And now knight to d2, h3. So what if white doesn't allow that trade and plays g3 and keeps the file closed against, this powerful rook? Okay, bishop to d6 developing. Queen e1, unpinning the knight and preparing the development of the queen. Although, think about it, where exactly? Except e3, there's nowhere else that makes sense. Knight to e7, develop. Rook to d1, let's look at this. Rook on the same file of our queen. Queen to b6, let's get out of it. Our opponent has a problem on the king side. This king is looking really ugly. If white, let's say, plays a4, the best move by black is long castle. Position evaluated is black was up a piece. So obviously, let's not go through a variation where our opponent gives us the bishop pair. So here, after queen b6, what if bishop goes to d3, for example? Okay, knight to b4 attacks the bishop. And yes, we do want to win that bishop. What if, let's make an example, queen e3, okay, take the bishop. Queen takes back, rook to c8. This is much better position for black. Knight to b3, not allowing the queen to go to b2 later on, simply allowing and preparing knight to c5. Not now, but later on at least. Our opponent might play c3 and consolidate the pawn chain. How do we get through in this type of position? e5. This is the key move. You're threatening e4. So after take, you're still threatening e4, and there's no way out of this. The knight is pinned, so if the knight moves, remember you have an attack on the rook. But the strongest move is e4. So let's look at this move, queen e3. Maybe desperate for trade, or simply, well, the queen will have to move. Well, okay, if queen e3, take it. Pawn takes back. And now you go up the exchange and you're completely winning. There's no point in even seeing this. So in this position, let's say, after pawn taking in e5, what if the rook unpins the white knight and tries to find some compensation? Is there any compensation? No. e4. Now it looks like white can play queen to d4. This is a brilliant move, or at least it looks like. Preparing a swap of queens, but also attacking the rook. Meaning that after the swap, if we do take this queen, the knight can take back, and white has saved everything. But here you just castle. And now the knight remains under attack. So if the knight moves, then you will just play rook takes pawn in c2, completely winning position. If instead our opponent takes our queen, pawn takes back, and now plays knight to d4 to save it from the attack. Well, okay, knight to c6. We're happy if we get taken, that's completely fine. Considering that white's bishop is never going to play. c3, consolidating the pawn structure, for example, fine, just knight e5. And this is not easy now, because what do you play as white? Why is the position evaluated -4? f4 cannot be played because you can just take it, you've got loads of attackers. a4, for instance, the idea of playing a5 and try to get the knight to develop, because that knight can't move anywhere. Knight to d3 attacks the rook. The rook can only go to a1. Or b1 to defend the pawn in b2, for example. Let's say rook b1. Okay, bishop to c5. And this cannot be taken, because if knight takes, then you take with the pawn, comes with an attack on the knight. The knight will have to move. The only square, well, it will be either c2, from where he can go to e3, because knight to b3 is attacking nothing. But either way, let's say knight c2, you will play d4 and produce a passed pawn. And it looks like, well, the pawn is attacked twice. So if white pawns takes in d4, then you take back. The knight cannot really take back in d4, because rook c4 traps it. And in this position, after knight to b3, this is actually very similar. Now you play just rook to f7. And you're going to exploit the lot of pressure you have on f2 by doubling up the rooks. You're going to have 3 pieces attacking that square. There's nothing our opponent can do. You can't even play king to h1 with the idea of bishop g1 to support it more, because first of all, it's just ridiculous. But also now this simply, this is already attackable. But the best thing to do here, the most accurate, is this move. And that's it. No coming back from here. Back at this position, just a few moves ago, remember when we just played queen to b6 and we said bishop to d3, but then we carry on with knight to b4 and attack the bishop again. What if the bishop goes to e2 instead? Okay, well, take the pawn. This is not a poisoned pawn, because after rook to b1, it looks like our opponent will reach the 7th rank. The main problem is that then you can take in c2, the rook takes in b2, in b7, and now rook to b8 forces a swap of rooks and gives black the open file. Position evaluated minus 250 for a reason. Black is just dominating, and his upper pawn as well. Queen to b1 tries to stay relevant. Swap it, and then the queen takes, and then the rook takes back. And crazy enough, we take this rook, because then when the rook takes back, you can play e5. And white's position is so stuck, the white pieces are so unable to do anything. They make no threats to anything, and after take with threatening e4, which will leave the white bishop, the light square bishop, hanging the following move. So let's look at this idea. Bishop f1 instead, to unpin the knight. Okay, well, e4. The knight will have to move. Knight to e1. Well, now we got an attack on d4. And we don't have to worry about the rook checking us, because this bishop is doing a very important job. Oh, and by the way, one last thing. After queen to b6 and the bishop going to d3, remember the variation with knight to b4? We said queen e3 and then swap, right? Of course, I didn't go through any other idea with the bishop, trying to preserve the bishop pair for our opponent, because bishop e2 allows knight c2 trapping the queen. This is just like... Look, there's many ways in which the game can go, and as far as I know, your opponent might never play the variation with queen to e1 in this game, but whatever they play, the fact that they're in this position indicates that this is a rubbish opening. And I'm trying to explain as many setups as possible, so you understand how to take the game each time. So here's another thing I forgot to say. Bishop g5, c5, e3, another thematic idea here. After playing f6, bishop h4, knight c6, bishop e5, pawn takes. What if white takes the knight immediately? Okay, pawn takes back. We don't care about having the knight on c6, it's not necessary. Pawn takes back in d4, queen to b6. You see how it's always the same things that will happen. b3, stopping us from arriving in that square. What else could be played? It's not like the queen can go to c1 to protect that, because you will take in d4. So, you gotta look at, when you watch the videos, and when you watch my videos and you think, oh, I don't know if this will go exactly like that, it's not very likely. Well, if it doesn't, that means it's a mistake. I'm showing all the most natural moves that our opponent can play and how to punish all of them. If your opponent plays something that hasn't even been seen in the saga at all, that's very likely just rubbish. Unless I've just started the saga and I haven't gone through that yet. Anyway, b3, e5. There's a lot of attack over that square now. Taking the pawn is not possible, obviously, because queen b4 check wins the bishop. So in this position, after playing e5, what if c3? Seems to be making sense. Okay, knight to h6. And now d takes e5 appears possible, because we don't have queen b4 anymore. Just take back. And now here, let's go through knight f3. Before that, let's look at queen h5. This seems to be making sense, because if you play g6, queen e5 check wins the rook. So this is really dangerous. Knight f7 just does the whole thing. Black has an idea of playing bishop to c5 in this position. If white plays knight to f3, normal developing moves. g6 just traps the queen. This is really funny. I mean, look how stupid this looks. So in this position, we just took back in e5. What if knight to f3 without the check of the queen? Okay, bishop to d6. Castle, knight f5 attacking the bishop. And that's how you're going to take it. Bishop to g3, take it. The pawn in f is pinned, so h has to take. And now castle. A move like queen to e2 now seems to be making sense, but simply e4 wins, because knight to d4 now, and now bishop to a6 wins material. We're going to be winning the rook. Well, I mean, you can say that the pawn can block, but then the knight in d4 is falling, so that's not going to happen. And in this position, if instead of queen e2, what if the knight goes to d2, right? Bishop to a6, again attacking the rook. And the rook to e1 just loses to bishop c5. Got too much attack, and our opponent is forced to go back to f1, but then we can win the exchange. So bishop to c5 wins because of the threat on f2. What if instead of rook e1 our opponent plays c4 in this position? Well, e4. And here we are. Because what's our opponent going to do now? Maybe, I don't know, knight h4 or something? Although the knight in h4 wouldn't be going anywhere next. Here now you can just take the pawn in g3 for free. And that's a huge advantage. What if knight to h2? Well, same stuff, just bishop takes in g3. Let's close the line here. Position evaluated minus 450. So let's do the very last recap actually. Bishop g5, c5, e3. f6, bishop h4. Knight c6, bishop b5. We take the pawn. Okay, we're looking at when they take the knight. Pawn takes back, pawn takes back. Queen to b6. b3 to prevent queen b2. Okay, e5. We said that this pawn cannot be taken. We went through pawn takes, c3, so let's go through knight f3 now. Okay, e4, immediately attack the knight. Knight will have to move. The knight can't just go to d2, for example, because you will just take in d2. It's just too strong. You're attacking the rook. White loses essential pawn for no reason, so that's just really bad. Queen to e2 pins the pawn, but now you just play knight to e7, and the knight is forced to go to g1. So knight to g1, but now you play knight to f5. It comes with an attack on the bishop. The bishop's hanging, so the bishop will have to move, but now it also comes with an attack on the pawn in d4. Although the most accurate move here is the sadistic h5. Because you see, now if white plays c3 to defend the pawn, h4 just wins the piece. The bishop is trapped. I mean, bishop f4, but then g5, you're trapping it. And also it's good to play h5 just to stop annoying queen h5 checks. So h5 here is the best move. Our opponent is forced to play h3. And now first we take this bishop, pawn takes back, this rook is now much weaker. And now we can just take the pawn in d4, and that's it, c3, but we're winning here. We've got the bishop pair, up a pawn, so let's not go any further. So in this position, instead of queen e2, or instead of knight to d2, as we saw that both just failed, what about knight to g1, trying to retain at least the material. Or so here now black goes on with knight to h6, and now let's pay attention to the fact that white can't just develop the knight to e2 and then castle, because you will punish it immediately. Bishop to g4 pins it. f3 is not possible because you're attacking it twice. So knight b to c3, let's look at this. Knight to f5 attacks the bishop. Bishop to g3, bishop to b4. The knight in e2 is pinned. That means that this knight is free to be taken. If the knight takes, then you win the queen. The queen will have to unpin, but whenever she does, you're winning this knight for free. What about queen to d2? Well, take this knight. The knight can't take back because the queen will be taken. If queen takes back, then you take the knight. So if king takes back, then queen to a5 finalizes the attack on this knight, and that's game over. And back a few moves ago, we said how knight to c3 just loses the game because of the weakness of this, you know, the weakness of the dark squares. What if instead our opponent plays knight to d2? Okay, same thing, knight to f5, the bishop is forced to go to g3, and now we take the knight in d4, and we're finalizing the attack over this knight that is not coming back already. Our opponent is forced to play pawn to d3 because we got two minor pieces attacking. Our opponent only has king and queen defending, so f3 is forced. And it looks like it's even possible because after take, and then pawn takes back, now you can take with check, knight takes back, and now you obviously recapture. Rook to f1, it's attacking the bishop. It doesn't look like we have anything in particular here, but except bishop b4 check. Should win the game very, very soon. So in this position, last thing we're going to see after knight e2 developing. Earlier we went through knight e2 developing and then bishop g4 and carry on with the game. What if white plays f3 straight away now? Okay, well, knight f5 attacks the bishop, bishop to g3, and now knight to e3 attacks the queen. The queen will have to move, but now you just take the pawn for free in d4. There's no compensation whatsoever. Queen d2, queen d4, but then you play knight c2, recapturing the queen, and you're easily winning this endgame. And back in this position, after knight f5 attacking the bishop, what if bishop goes to f2? Here, this is even worse. You just play e3. Now it looks like we have lost our square e3 now to go with the knight. So the bishop can go to g3. And then if we take, the pawn takes back and our opponent will have the open file for the rook. But remember, we go double attack over the square d4. And anyway, the most accurate way now to continue is h5. You know why.